Hello my friends. What you're looking at here is more than a week's worth of food, and it is pemmican. This is my dinner, and it's pemmican. To make pemmican, you want to start with grass-fed red meat, and here I'm using venison. And I'm cutting across the grain because after this is dried, I'm going to pulverize it, make it into a fine powder. And this is par frozen, making it hold up to the knife so that I can cut it a little easier. Now I'm going to dehydrate this at a lower temperature, about 120 degrees. You don't want to cook the meat. Cooking the meat will ruin it for pemmican. When you dry meat for pemmican, you do not want to marinate it. You don't put spices on it. You just want dried meat.
Here's the meat in the dehydrator. Some of the meat was ground meat. This was ground meat that was partially frozen, and I sliced it so that made it easier. You see it breaks real easy. Made it easier to dry this way. And some of the meat was solid. This was backstrap, and I cut it across the grain, and you can see how easy this breaks up. And of course this was dried without any spices. The meat needs to be very dry, and it's dried below 120 degrees. If it's any hotter, it cooks the meat. You don't want the meat to be cooked because that destroys a lot of the nutrients that is in the grass-fed meat. And the tallow that you're going to use, the tallow should be also from grass-fed animals, and the tallow should be rendered at about 200 degrees. I find the best way to render tallow is in the oven. You don't take a chance of overheating. When you're rendering on the stove top, as the moisture evaporates out of the fat, the temperature will start to rise, and you could lose control of the heating. If you put it in the oven, you can set the oven at 200 degrees and leave it overnight, and you don't have to watch it. Very dry meat. Okay, next step is to pulverize this into a powder.
Next, what I'm going to do before I start pulverizing it is I'm going to break it up into smaller chunks. And traditionally what was done is the meat was pounded with mortar and pestle, or just on a rock with another rock. One of the quicker ways is to put this into a blender, which I'm going to do that because it will break it up a lot quicker. And the larger chunks I can put in the mortar and pestle. And you can see how easy this breaks up. I cut it extra thin, thinner than what I would normally do jerky that I want to eat. Traditionally there was no spice. If they had berries, they would add some dried berries, but you only want to put about 5% of berries in the total mix. And of course the berries, they need to be dried also. If the meat, when you bend it, if it doesn't break when you bend it or snap, it's still too moist. If you can't get to processing the pemmican right away, store the meat in an airtight container And you want to keep this in a cool, dry place out of the sun. I find the easiest way to pulverize the dried meat is to use my blender. A lot of people, they like to, when they break the meat up, they like to leave it some small chunks. I like to run mine through a sieve. Gives a much better texture. The fat absorbs into this much easier and quicker, and it makes it easier to chew. Of course, the Native Americans didn't have a blender. They have made pemmican for generations, and it sustained them through the winter time. And when they did traveling, that's all they had to carry. It was an ideal food, gave perfect nutrition. And when they dried the meat, it usually was outdoors in the sun. Occasionally they would dry it over the low heat of a fire, but they didn't cook it. Cooking it would spoil the meat for long-term preservation. When you do this in the blender, you don't want to overfill the blender. It just won't be able to mix it all. So a small amount, and then just keep chopping it up, and shake it every once in a while so it's not sticking to the sides. Now, remembering when you're making meat, we're using red meat that's grass-fed, and this is organic. This is venison. Traditionally, the meat was from the wild animal. Bison was the main source for the Plains Indians, and of course they also used venison. And the tallow should be from also grass-fed. If you don't have a source of tallow, you can buy it online, and that's what I did. I used organic grass-fed beef tallow, and that's I didn't have the access. I had the meat, deer meat, processed and in the freezer, and I rotate the meat. The older meat gets used first, and it'll keep almost indefinitely as a pemmican dried, and it does not need to be refrigerated. Just need to keep it out of direct sunlight and in a cool place. Ready to be added with the tallow. Here's a little bit of old school here. The last bit, the blender will not chop it up. Not enough of a volume in there. So I'm using this high-walled mortar and pestle. I went through my pantry and I found a couple of jars of dried blueberries. And you can see in this one I have the oxygen inhibitor in it. So I'm going to take these. We don't want to grind that up. I'm going to grind these up into a powder, and this powder then can be added to the jerky. And of course you don't want any more than 5% in the mix. So 50% meat, and then 45% tallow, and then it's 5% of the berries. And you can buy berries that have already been dried. You can buy freeze-dried. I saw Big Lots having freeze-dried strawberries. So that would be a good additive also. So let's see how this will do as far as pulverizing it. And again, what I'll do is I'll run it through the sieve and regrind the larger chunks.
By grinding this up and making a smaller powder, this will allow it to spread more uniformly through the mix. And then what you want to do is mix this with the dry ingredients, which is the meat. So if you're going to add any other type of a spice, you want to mix it thoroughly with the powdered meat. And then the last thing you do is you mix the powder in the heated up tallow. When you heat the tallow, you want to keep the temperature around 220 degrees, and since it's already rendered, you don't want it any hotter than that. And the reason you keep it lower is you don't want to be cooking the meat. You went through a lot of trouble to dry the meat and not cook it, so we don't want to cook it as we're mixing it with the liquid tallow. Here I'm weighing my ingredients. So I have the meat and the powdered berries together. We need to add the tallow. Right there. Ingredients are weighed out. Now I'm going to transfer this tallow into a pan. The tallow melts at about 120 degrees. So I'm going to keep a close eye on this. I have it on a low heat, and as soon as it's all melted, we know that we're at about 120 degrees. So at that point I will mix in the dry ingredients, which is the meat and the berry mix. You can see it's almost all gone. Okay, once the tallow is melted, we can turn the heat off, and then we add our ingredients and we start adding, and the fat will absorb or go into this powder pretty readily. And you can see in here that the fat still is puddling. So even though we weighed all the ingredients out, we need to add more meat. There's a good consistency there. Here I weighed out the pemmican, and this weighs 10.5 ounces. So that is approximately 2,000 calories. And 2,000 calories is just about enough to sustain an adult for a day. So I kind of have to match this one, which is a heaping serving in this cupcake mold. Now you could put this in a Ziploc baggie and then divide it. Press on the baggie with like a pencil or something, or a chopstick, into 3 equal parts, and that would give you roughly your 3 meals for the day. I've been eating it as I've been making it. It does have a really good flavor. Now this is made with venison, and venison has a pretty strong taste, pretty strong gamey taste. The pemmican does not have that strong venison taste. You cannot taste that dominant venison flavor. What I found, if you do the 50-50 mix, it's too much fat, too high a fat, and the consistency just isn't right. So you have to add, right there is your 50-50 mix, approximately, and you see how wet it still looks. Okay. This is the consistency that you're looking for. You can see there's no tallow that's pulling, and it's still moist. It can still stick together. Storing your pemmican, this is for long-term storage. This is how I do it. I place it into a large mason jar, and that's mainly to keep insects and rodents away from it. Moisture is the enemy of long-term storage. Then I take my canning lid, I use my food saver, press this cap over it. Now the food saver has a port. You plug that hose into the port and into this lid. Then you press the vacuum, which is for the canister. Okay, break the seal. Remove this lid. Okay, you can see here it already formed a vacuum. You see the indentation. What I'm going to do to this is I will label the top, and I also labeled the jar. So 2 labels. I also put the date, and this is pretty much infinite storage. That's really long-term food. So I'm using these Avery labels, and I will label that it is deer. That's the meat that I used. Put the date on it, which is 2020, and pemmican. Okay, now place this on the jar, and there's a smooth area there. Okay, that in itself, what I found is has a tendency over time to peel, come off occasionally. So I'm using packaging tape going across, and this makes that label a long term. And then on the top of the lid, in case that fails or comes off, I'll label it pemmican. This ring isn't needed. I put it on just in case. If the seal breaks, this pemmican will still store. This ring will keep the lid from coming off, and it will keep any rodents or insects away from that. This is a 2-quart jar of dried potatoes, and this was stored without the metal ring, which I mentioned earlier. Found this lid laying on the floor. It was canned in 2015, and anytime I do this, I put the mix on there and I label the jar. Now, this lid was found laying on the floor, so the jar was open. If you look inside, this is what can happen. I have oxygen desiccate in there, and the moisture absorber, and you can see mice feces. Important reason to keep rings on these jars. Okay, now this is going to go into my food reserve in my basement. It'll be out of direct sunlight and it'll be cool. So this is high energy, full meal, full nutrition. Good addition to anybody's storage. Venison by itself has a very strong flavor, a gamey flavor. A lot of people don't like that. As pemmican, it does not have a gamey flavor. I have a little bit of blueberries in this. The blueberries have been pulverized. They've been dried first, and then ground into a powder. The powder then is mixed with the dried meat that also has been pounded or pulverized into a fine powder. And then that combined mixture is then mixed in with tallow. And the tallow is from grass-fed red meat. Now, back in the 70s, they were considering fat to be very unhealthy, and they pushed margarine and oleo, and to me it's like a molecule away from plastic oil, like an oil product, and I never did like the idea of eating that. I stuck with butter. But for pemmican, you can't use butter. You have to use tallow from grass-fed red meat. Now the Plains Indians, typically they would use buffalo, but they would use any of the grass foraging animals for a pemmican food. This is surprisingly a lot of food, a lot of filling. Now to make the best, healthiest pemmican, some fundamental things to follow, and let me review some of these things. First of all, when you dry the meat, FDA recommends that the meat should be dried at 150 degrees Fahrenheit. The best pemmican is dried below 120 degrees. If you're 120 degrees or higher, you're cooking the meat, and you want to dehydrate the meat. When you cook the meat, you're losing a lot of the nutrients. But as long as you keep it below the 120, I dried mine in my dehydrator, and I had it set at 120 degrees. And it took, I let it dry for almost 24 hours. So overnight usually is good, but I wanted to make sure all the moisture was out of the meat. Then the tallow, the best is to make your own tallow. If you can make it out of the meat that you harvested, the deer meat or elk or bison, then you have a real good grass-fed. But the grass-fed tallow will provide all the nutrients that will keep you perfectly healthy. To start the recipe, you should try to mix a 50% tallow, 50% dried powdered meat by weight, not the volume, by weight. But what I find is when you're doing that, the pemmican is too greasy. The tallow will absorb a lot of the powdered dried meat. You don't want to over add any of the berries. If you have the berries, it was preferred to add additional flavor, but don't over add. And also when you add the berries, you have to have the moisture extracted out of that. The reason pemmican can store almost indefinitely is because of no moisture in the food. You want to keep it at, you can store it at room temperature. You want it out of direct sunlight. When you make the tallow, if you can cut the fat or the suet very small. Some people run it through a grinder. Put it in a pan, put it in your oven. You want to keep the temperature of the tallow below 150 degrees. Above that, you're starting to destroy a lot of the nutrients that's in there. A lot of people were concerned that you're not going to get calcium for your bone health. If the meat that you're making the pemmican out of is grass-fed, it will be loaded with omega-3 fatty acids, and it will contain calcium, so it will maintain your bone health. Also, they had concerns of developing scurvy, because this is the only food you're eating. They have no cases of scurvy being developed from a diet on pemmican. It's been tested over and over for hundreds of years. Need to find the tallow. I have a link to the tallow on Amazon, and this is grass-fed tallow, so that would be one of the main ingredients that you would need. The dried meat, if you hunt, you could take your deer or whatever other meat. I'm taking meat that I had in my freezer. That meat I rotate, so I'm consuming that. I cut that up, dry that. I took the hamburger that I had, I dried that also in my dehydrator, and then I pulverized it after it was dried. The taste is very pleasant. Not a problem to consume this, and if you're working hard, hungry, this will provide plenty of energy. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it was very informative. If you're backpacking, hiking, or winter camping, this would be a food that you could take along, and it's virtually infinite shelf life. Keep it dry, out of direct sunlight, you're good to go. Thanks for watching, my friends. Bye-bye.